Imagine looking at a fossil and thinking you've discovered a monster unlike anything that ever walked the earth. Imagine spending years sketching its bones, building its image, publishing it to the world, only for later generations to realize you were completely wrong. Science is full of brilliant discoveries, but it's also full of mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes are more fascinating than the truth itself. Before we dive into these forgotten errors of paleontology, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the next story about life and death from a world long gone. These are the prehistoric animals scientists got horribly wrong. When paleontology was still a young science in the 19th century, fossil hunters were racing across Europe and America, eager to be the first to describe new creatures. Museums competed to collect bones, newspapers published dramatic illustrations, and the public became obsessed with dinosaurs. But with every fossil that was dug up, there was a problem: nobody really knew how these animals looked, moved, or lived. Scientists only had fragments, sometimes just a skull or a few ribs, and from those fragments they had to build entire creatures. And human imagination, as it always does, filled in the gaps with spectacular errors. One of the most famous mistakes was made with a dinosaur called Iguanodon. When its fossils were first discovered in England in the early 1800s, no one had ever seen anything like it. Huge teeth shaped like those of an iguana, but much larger, convinced scientists this was a gigantic reptile unlike anything alive. But how did it look? Early reconstructions placed a massive horn on its nose, a sharp weapon for defense. For decades, books and museum displays showed Iguanodon as a bulky reptile with a rhino-like horn jutting out of its face. The truth? That horn was actually its thumb. A giant spiked thumb it used possibly for defense or breaking open plants. Generations of children stared up at museum statues of a dinosaur that never really existed, a creature born out of a misplaced bone. And then there was the mighty Brontosaurus, the thunder lizard, an icon of prehistoric imagery. In the late 1800s, during the so-called Bone Wars in America, paleontologists Neil Marsh and Edward Cope were locked in a ruthless competition to outdo each other. Marsh discovered a massive skeleton and hurried to publish it as a brand new dinosaur, naming it Brontosaurus. But in his rush, he made a critical error. He placed the wrong skull on the skeleton. For decades, museums displayed Brontosaurus with the head of another dinosaur entirely, giving the world an animal that never truly lived. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that scientists corrected the mistake, realizing Brontosaurus was actually an Apatosaurus, and even that name sparked debates for years. Millions grew up with Brontosaurus in textbooks, cartoons, and movies. All because of one rushed reconstruction and a war of egos. Not all errors were about skulls and names, some were about entire ways of life. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, dinosaurs were thought to be slow, sluggish reptiles, dragging their tails like oversized lizards. Illustrations showed them wallowing in swamps, too heavy to walk on land. The massive Diplodocus, for example, was shown as a creature that could barely move its own weight, surviving only by floating in shallow water. Scientists thought their bodies would collapse on land. This idea stuck for generations, even appearing in Hollywood films. But later research showed these dinosaurs were strong, dynamic, and perfectly capable of walking across land. Their tails were not dragging uselessly in the mud, they were counterbalances. Possibly even weapons, swung with incredible force. Dinosaurs, once imagined as lazy swamp dwellers, were actually some of the most successful and active creatures the Earth had ever seen. And sometimes the mistakes were even stranger. Take the case of the Elasmosaurus, a marine reptile discovered in Kansas in the 1860s. When paleontologist Edward Cope reconstructed its skeleton, he placed the long neck backward, giving it a tail where its head should have been. The result was a bizarre creature unlike anything possible, yet Cope proudly published it. When Marsh, his rival, pointed out the mistake, Cope was humiliated, but the damage was done. For years, confusion surrounded this animal, and it became a symbol of how even brilliant scientists could be blinded by haste and pride. Another example comes from the fearsome Megalosaurus. When it was first described in 1824, it was the very first dinosaur ever given a scientific name. But the image people had of it was utterly wrong. Without a full skeleton, early scientists imagined Megalosaurus as a massive lizard that crawled on four legs, looking something like a monstrous Komodo dragon. In reality, Megalosaurus was a bipedal predator, walking onto powerful hind legs, far more like the later vision of a T-Rex than a lumbering lizard. For decades, Megalosaurus was displayed in London's Crystal Palace Park as a squat, four-legged monster that never actually existed. Tourists walked among life-size statues of these imagined beasts, marveling at reconstructions that were more fiction than fact. Even as paleontology advanced into the 20th century, mistakes continued. Dinosaurs were often drawn with lizard-like, scaly skin, their colors imagined in dull browns and greens. They were seen as evolutionary dead ends, failures that had been outcompeted by mammals. But discoveries in the late 20th and early 21st centuries revealed a very different picture. Many dinosaurs, especially smaller theropods, had feathers, bright colors, and behaviors closer to modern birds than reptiles. The fearsome velociraptor, made famous by Jurassic Park, was not a scaly, human-sized killer, but a feathered predator barely the size of a turkey. The real animal would have looked more like a deadly bird of prey than a reptilian monster. Even today, popular culture struggles to let go of the older, inaccurate image. These mistakes weren't failures of science, but stepping stones. Each wrong reconstruction pushed paleontologists to look closer, to gather more evidence, and to refine their methods. From plaster casts and hand-drawn sketches, the science advanced to CT scans, 3D modeling, and microscopic analysis of fossilized skin and feathers. The errors of the past remind us that knowledge is never static, it evolves, just like life itself. But perhaps the most important lesson in all of this is that our imagination shapes how we see the past. The creatures that lived millions of years ago cannot defend themselves against our misunderstandings. They exist only as fragments of bone and stone, waiting for us to give them form. And in our rush to make them real, we often create monsters of our own. The horned Iguanodon, the swamp-dwelling Diplodocus, the backward Elasmosaurus, all ghosts of ideas that once walked through museums and textbooks, now replaced by truer visions. Yet in their own way, those mistakes became part of the story of science and part of the strange afterlife of animals that have been extinct for millions of years. So the next time you look at a fossil reconstruction or a dinosaur in a movie, remember, it might not be the truth. It might just be the latest version of a story still being rewritten. And who knows how many of the animals we think we know today will one day join the list of prehistoric creatures scientists got horribly wrong. For every prehistoric animal that was reconstructed wrong, there is a story not only of bones and stone, but of people, their ambitions, their rivalries, their imaginations. Science is not built in a vacuum. It is shaped by the human hands that piece fossils together and the human eyes that want to see monsters, giants, and legends. When we talk about prehistoric animals that scientists got horribly wrong, what we are really seeing is a mirror of ourselves, our eagerness to explain the unknown, our mistakes when we rush, and our creativity when facts are missing. Think of the mastodon and the mammoth. When their bones were first discovered in the Americas, They were seen not as extinct creatures, but as proof that giant elephants still roamed undiscovered somewhere deep in the wilderness. Thomas Jefferson himself believed such animals must still be alive and willing to accept extinction as even possible. Early drawings and reconstructions of these beasts placed them as savage carnivores, imagined as bone-crushing monsters with enormous fangs. One early reconstruction even showed a mastodon using its tusks to slash open prey, a vision more like a dragon than an elephant. The truth, of course, is that mastodons were plant eaters, more closely related to elephants than to predators. Yet for decades, their image was twisted by human refusal to believe in extinction. Then there was the case of the Glyptodon, the giant armadillo that once roamed South America. When its fossilized shells were found, local farmers thought they were the remains of enormous turtles, and even used them as roofs for shelters. Scientists at first believed the same until they realized the animal was not aquatic at all, but a massive land-dwelling armored mammal with a tail club powerful enough to crush bones. The misinterpretation of Glyptodon's shell as a turtle carapace shows just how easy it was for both ordinary people and scientists to see what they wanted to see, rather than what the evidence truly showed. And sometimes, the errors were born from national pride and the desire to impress. Consider the Crystal Palace dinosaurs of the 1850s, the very first life-sized reconstructions of prehistoric creatures ever built. Designed by artist Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, they were based on the best knowledge available at the time, but that knowledge was incomplete, and imagination filled in the rest. Megalosaurus, as we mentioned before, was built as a massive four-legged lizard, lumbering across the ground like a crocodile with legs. Iguanodon was sculpted with its horned nose, an error that would not be corrected until decades later. Visitors marveled at these statues, walking through a park where creatures of the past stood larger than life. But what they were really seeing was the science of the mid-19th century frozen in stone, a world of mistakes that would later be ridiculed, but that nonetheless captured the public's fascination. Even today, those statues remain, relics of a time when paleontology was more art than science, and imagination was allowed to run wild. The mistakes weren't always accidental. In some cases, they were deliberate. During the Bone Wars, Cope and Marsh weren't just rivals, they were enemies, desperate to humiliate one another. When Cope placed the head of Elasmosaurus on the wrong end of its body, Marsh gleefully exposed the error, printing it in journals and mocking Cope publicly. The humiliation was so great that Cope reportedly bought back every copy of the journal he could find, trying to erase the mistake from history. But mistakes have a way of living longer than triumphs. Today, most people don't remember Cope's dozens of correct identifications, but everyone remembers the Elasmosaurus with its head on its tail. And sometimes, the mistakes revealed just how limited our understanding of evolution was. When the first Neanderthal skulls were found in the 19th century, scientists reconstructed them as brutish, ape-like savages. Illustrations showed them barely human, dragging clubs, with vacant expressions. For nearly a century, Neanderthals were considered little more than beasts, a failed evolutionary experiment. But modern science paints a very different picture. Neanderthals were skilled toolmakers, hunters, and even artists. They buried their dead, used pigments, and may have had complex language. Far from being brutish, they were intelligent survivors. The old image of the savage caveman was horribly wrong, a projection of prejudice rather than fact. The same thing happened with the so-called Piltdown Man, one of the most infamous scientific frauds in history. In 1912, fossils were discovered in England that seemed to show a perfect missing link between apes and humans, a human-like skull with an ape-like jaw. Scientists hailed it as proof that human evolution began in Britain, not Africa. For decades, textbooks taught Piltdown Man as fact. But in the 1950s, The truth was revealed: it was a hoax, a mixture of a medieval human skull and an orangutan jaw, artificially aged to look ancient. Scientists had been fooled not just by the bones, but by their own desire to believe. They wanted the missing link to be in Europe, and so they saw what they wished to see. This wasn't just horribly wrong, it was a reminder that science is vulnerable to pride and deception. Even giant marine reptiles weren't safe from misinterpretation. When fossils of plesiosaurs were discovered, artists imagined them crawling onto land like seals, resting their long necks across beaches. Early reconstructions showed them twisting their necks like snakes, even tying themselves in knots, something their bones would never have allowed. In truth, their necks were far stiffer, designed for sweeping through water to snatch prey. But the image of these animals as snake-necked serpents persisted in books and art for years, more mythology than biology. What makes all of these mistakes so fascinating is that they remind us of just how difficult it is to reconstruct the past. Fossils are not like complete blueprints. They are fragments, broken by time, scattered across millions of years. To build an animal from them is like trying to rebuild a book from a handful of torn pages. Sometimes, the missing words are guessed correctly. But just as often, the guesses are wrong, and the story we tell is not the one that was ever written in life. Yet these mistakes had power. They captured imaginations, inspired artists, and brought prehistoric life into the public consciousness. The horned iguanodon may have been wrong, but it inspired generations of children to dream of dinosaurs. The swamp-bound diplodocus may have been inaccurate, but it made people ask questions about how such giants could live. Even the brutish Neanderthals, misrepresented for decades, created an enduring cultural image that still echoes in movies and literature today. In being wrong, scientists still managed to bring the prehistoric world to life for millions of people. But as we look back, it's impossible not to wonder, which of today's reconstructions will tomorrow's scientists laugh at? We now imagine dinosaurs with feathers, bright colors, and behaviors closer to birds. We use CT scans to reconstruct skull cavities and lasers to estimate muscle mass. We think we are closer to the truth than ever. But history teaches us that certainty is dangerous. What we know today may one day be as outdated as the horned iguanodon or the swamp-bound diplodocus. The past is always shifting beneath our feet, and our vision of it is never complete. And that uncertainty, in its own way, is thrilling. Because if we've been wrong before, it means there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered, creatures we have not yet imagined correctly, worlds still hidden in stone. Science is not about getting everything right the first time. It is about learning from mistakes, correcting them, and inching closer to the truth with every discovery. The prehistoric animals scientists got wrong are not failures, they are milestones on the journey of understanding.